to episode 30 of BeyondU. I'm Aaron, and I'm here with Ben. Ben, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, we're in summer mode here.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, definitely. And Tori Martin.
Heyo.
Welcome back.
It's good to be here. Season 2 just wrapped up.
Yeah,
Isn't
that's
that
right.
Crazy.
We're ending it right now. It's finale of season 2.
Wild.
It's great to have this conversation with you both. It's been just really looking forward to having this conversation with all of us here around the table. We've had so many different conversations with amazing guests, amazing topics, and we want to take a look back at where we've come from and some of the highlights of that. For those who may not have been with us the whole time, who maybe you've discovered us recently in a recent episode, and you want to know more about what BeyondU is about, the conversations we've had, and the great content that you can discover with us. We're going to take a look back and just talk about a little bit about what you can expect coming forward. Before we do that, I want to have a quick chat with you both about some of the things that we've seen happening, maybe a news headline that relates to something we've talked about earlier. If you joined us for episode 28 with Dr. Josh McNall, you may remember we talked about doubt and dogmatism, but in that conversation we touched on the polarization of our culture and why it feels like it's so hard to have kind of a middle ground conversation and kind of address how we can bring the temperature down. So I wanted to get both of your reactions to a headline that I saw this week.
Sure.
Maybe you've seen it. Religion News Service is publishing this article by the headline that the Presbyterian Church in America canceled a recently announced panel on helping pastors deal with polarization, saying that the topic was too divisive. Okay. So leaders of the 339,000 member denomination last week announced that the panel titled How to Be Supportive of Your Pastor and Church Leaders in a Polarized Political Year. They canceled it because of the inclusion of an author and New York Times columnist, David French. Maybe you've heard of him. For those of you who may be listening, you don't know who David French is. He's a longtime PCA member who recently left the denomination. He's an outspoken conservative who has tried to do this very thing, which is address polarization and be a great moderate voice. And many of the critics have labeled French because of his opposition to Donald Trump as being liberal and divisive. And they accused the organizers of this event of rancor and controversy over politics. So that's interesting based on the conversation we just had. I'm curious to know what you both think of that kind of ironic title.
We had to cancel something for polarization because it was too polarizing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Makes
That in
perfect
and
sense,
of
right?
itself. Yeah. It is interesting, though. Like, I wonder, because you know that this isn't happening just in the PCA circle. Like, it's everywhere, right? So this, in some ways, is a microcosm. But I do wonder, when I think about this particular instance, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we get to the point where we can't even have a conversation about a topic that is about polarizing, the tension in society? We can't have that conversation because it's too polarizing. Like, how do we
bizarre.
get here? I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about, and I've thought a lot about, is, we've even chatted about this just amongst us, the ability to assume goodwill.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the ability to disagree respectfully are two things that we've just lost touch with, to say, look, I disagree with you, but David French or whoever it may be, I still think you're a decent human being.
Yeah.
Right? Why is it so difficult for us to do that? I think part of it is we get, I think in our hyper identity-based society, where, identity is ubiquitous, like it's everywhere. It's, we get our identity so attached to these external things, if it's politics or whatever it may be, that when we perceive a threat to that, it's not only that somebody disagrees with me, but now this is an attack, right? And so our response then is not only to say, look, I disagree with you, but I almost feel compelled to have to vilify you as a person. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like, it's just kind of strange. And I don't know how we've gotten here, but...
like, we can't leave the disagreement alone. Like, it's not just enough to be like, I disagree. Let's move on.
Yeah.
No, it's like, I disagree, and we're going to fight about this.
Right.
And I'm going to do my best to destroy you because you disagree with me. It's not enough just to disagree. It's to go after that person.
Yeah.
And there's kind of this heap-on effect of the people you're speaking to on your side will just kind of pile on and
Yeah.
pile on.
And I think that's one of the things that Josh talked about in the podcast is when it comes to dogmatism, it's just kind of this monster that both sides fuel the other, right? When we just react, and the more that we react to each other, the further and further we move away from each other, and the wider this middle ground, becomes. So it's interesting.
There's something, while we're talking about this, I want to give the benefit of the doubt to the organizer of the
Sure.
event too,
For sure.
because I'm sure that, when you're trying to address something like this that's contentious, you are going to receive flack, and you get put in a position where you have to respond somehow. I'm trying to imagine what would happen if I were in their shoes. And I'm trying to think of what either of you would think about how to go about either responding to an audience like this. I mean, at what point do you continue on, even though it is kind of controversial or you're catching flack? And at what point do you say, we're going to do this, even if this person might be catching some attention that, doesn't look great for us?
Cool. I wish there was a silver bullet answer on that. I don't know that there is. I think kind of in what Ben was saying, we've enveloped this idea that policies and topics of conversation are central to DNA or identity. And part of this, I think, in leading events like this or leading conversations, we have to help people understand that people are different than policy. People are different than topics. People are different. Like, we have to keep people at the center and remain connected to our fellow human being, because through that, there's this lens of compassion that is missing in these conversations. It's completely missing in how we interact with our fellow human beings. So I think compassion and empathy is central to this conversation. So how do you go about leading that way? I don't really know in this particular, in that setting, in this PCA conversation, but I think keeping compassion and empathy for the fellow human being has to be somewhere in that mix.
Yeah,
it just has to be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a thought, but I don't know where it went. I'm sure it was brilliant, but it just.
Well, I think that's the unfortunate. It's funny and ironic because David French has written a book called "Divided We Fall: America's Secession Threat and How to Restore a Nation," which is all about this very issue of polarization. How do we address this? How do we address the tribalism that's leading us to potentially another civil conflict like we had in the 1800s? So if we can't have a conversation where somebody has done some deep research and thought about this and can present some ideas, that's concerning to me. That we can't have that conversation.
It's interesting, when we all kind of click through our news feeds or social media feeds, just how, and there's probably various reasons for this, but the only voices that we tend to tune in with are the ones that we agree with, and that just continue to fuel, right, the narratives that we already believe, as opposed to exposing ourselves to maybe just, whether we agree or not, right, but just exposing ourselves to a different point of view, if nothing else, just to learn, right? And I think, that goes back to part of what I think, you can't legislate morality. Like we can't make a law against making everybody agree with each other. That's not the point. But I think one of the things that we can do is to kind of restore and redeem the value of listening, to understand, not to listen to interject. And there's a difference, because we've all had conversations where we just know they're looking at us, but they're just waiting to tell you what they think.
And they're not hearing a word you're saying.
Right.
And for some reason, I think part of this whole cultural conversation is the anxiety we feel by assuming that by listening to understand that we're actually agreeing with somebody else, right? When in the reality is maybe it's just kind of like you talked about, Tori, it's compassion and grace, that at the end of the day we still may disagree.
Right.
But that's okay, right? We can still get along.
Well, and I feel like in one of the episodes that we had in season 2, we talked to 2 of our students, and we even brought up kind of the political conversation for Gen Z. There is this disassociation with that conversation right now, and I think part of it is because they've seen how we have handled it poorly in other generations with this polarization. Like, if you're not with me, you're against me. No, what if it's not that way? Like, what if it's, we disagree and that's okay. We're going to see things differently.
Yeah.
And so what I think we're starting to see, and even our students, like I said, they said this, like, they just don't want anything to do with it because it's become a lightning rod. And we've weaponized conversations that instead of an opportunity to learn from our fellow human being, we've weaponized it. We've made it almost dehumanizing to an extent. Yeah. And so people just don't want anything to do with it. Like, we as believers in Jesus, like, the example of compassion for the fellow human being should be leading and having conversations in a different tone and in a different manner. Yeah. And so we've got a societal issue on our hand, but I think it's something that we as believers can lead the way in.
Yeah, definitely.
I had an interesting conversation with a student a while ago. I read a book not long ago called The Man Who Ran Washington. It was on James A. Baker III. He worked for President Reagan as his chief of staff and Secretary of State for several years. But in the administration, in the 80s, you had Ronald Reagan, who was Republican president, and you had Tip O'Neill, who was a Democrat. And these guys would battle it out all day, right? In interviews, they would disagree with each other. They would belittle each other. But guess they would do it that night. They would go out to dinner together and put their differences aside and just connect because they generally were friends. And so I was talking to students. They were like, "Wait, you can do that?" Like, I mean, because it's just that's kind of a foreign concept to them that you can have a relationship with somebody that you disagree with, and be true to what you believe, and yet still have compassion.
You know, that reminds me of something in this conversation that has come back to my college education. Shout out to my communication professor, Dr. Scott Turcott, for media theory class, where we discussed a media theory that's basically about the idea that that in online communication, there's this theory or observed effect where people actually kind of bring down their walls and overshare more, and that you can kind of there's this vulnerability where people can share and communicate more and differently than they would in person. So in one sense, that can lead to vulnerability. In another sense, that can actually lead to higher attacks.
Right.
To saying things that if you were face-to-face with somebody, you might think twice about saying that thing. And so I think you're right that we need to get back to more of an emphasis on face-to-face communication, being present with people, and not leaving all of these kinds of conversations online. So.
Yeah, there's no substitute for face-to-face personal conversations.
For sure, absolutely. Yeah. For those of you listening, we've referenced a conversation with some students. I highly encourage you to go back to that episode 27, where we talked with two servant leaders, and we touched on this, but also a lot of other great perspectives from them. If you're curious to know a little bit more about what people from that generation are thinking, that's a great episode. Well, we've already touched on some... We've touched on some things that we've kind of found as highlights for this season. Let's dive into that conversation about what are some takeaways for us. We've had quite the range, from AI to leadership to Gen Z and even to the Oscars and history.
Like movies.
So we've covered quite a lot of ground. So I'm curious from both of you, and because in different episodes, each of us has had a chance to talk to different folks. I'm curious to know what are some of the things that have stood out for you in this season. Ben, what's something that surprised you in a conversation you've had?
Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised me was our conversation with Kenny Jang. It was kind of early in season 2, but about AI. And, he one of the things that he said, if you go back and listen, is really encouraging organizations to develop, kind of a policy towards AI. And I mean, we talked about theology of technology, and I think that was just surprising to me because there are very few people who have an indifferent view about AI and technology. They either think it's the best thing that's happening to humanity or the worst thing. There's not much in between, right? And because we don't have a theology of technology or some sort of policy in place that gives us some handles on it, it can run amok, right? So I think that's one of the things that surprised me that I really learned is, it makes sense, like, we believe that God is God overall, and including technology. And so how can we be faithful with this next level of technology that's coming our way? He kind of talked about, like, when when cars were invented, people probably thought it was the end of the world because people weren't going to do it, and then the television, right,
Yeah.
and the internet, and of course it changed humanity, but we figured it out,
Yeah.
right, and so there's no reason to assume anything different. So that was something that was
Yeah.
surprising to me that I learned
Definitely.
quite a
Yeah.
bit. Tori, for
Yeah.
you,
Yeah, that episode was one that continues to kind of come back to mind because AI is quite literally, I mean, you even open Facebook now, and what is it on the search bar? It's Meta AI.
Yeah.
And I saw someone the other day on my newsfeed that was like, I will stop using Facebook. You know, it was one of those copy paste messages.
Yes.
Like, if Facebook doesn't remove this Meta AI, I'm done with Facebook. I'm like, dude, you better just sign off now because
Yeah.
it's not going away.
Yeah.
So that conversation was definitely incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
You know, another conversation this season that I found to be helpful was our conversation. I think it was episode 26 with Stacy Duke and
Yeah.
Aaron Bunker, talking through strengths and why
Yes.
that's so important, especially for leadership and a personal sense, but also a professional sense, knowing who you are, knowing how God made you, and how you leverage that personally and professionally. I found just to be such a value
Yeah.
add. So
Yeah, definitely. It was really cool to have, because either of them have different spheres that they work
Mm-hmm.
in, you know, directly with the team or with business experience like Stacy has had. I found it really cool to kind of hear those perspectives from a couple of different areas.
yeah.
I'm curious to know, like, from that, if there's any like strengths conversation or like what specifically about strengths in that conversation has kind of stood out to you for
Yeah.
the audience.
And this might be just me picking on myself. Like, I can tend to look at life through the lens of what am I not good at?
Yeah.
And I can hone in on more of the like, oh, I'm weak in this area, and kind of almost to a self-deprecation level, like, ugh, like I can't believe you're not good at that, rather than appreciating. And then we talked about that in that episode, that strengths gives us a language to kind of unify our conversations, but it also gives us a language of appreciation. Like, Ben, I know that for you, like the strengths that you possess, like that's something that I can appreciate and actually lean on, even in my own work. That I don't have to be all things to all people. Like, that's why God puts us around other people that He's equipped differently. And so that was particularly helpful,
That's great.
to not see the negative side of that. And granted, every strength has the shadow side, and we talked about
Right.
that too. But to really see the beauty in not only the strengths of others around you, but even the beauty and the strengths that God has equipped you with
Yeah.
for yourself.
Yeah.
it's almost biblical, right? I mean, so,
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, that's one of the things we talk about is, you know, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and 12, before the love chapter, Paul talks about this rhythm of different and same, right? The body of Christ is supposed to be different. We have different gifts, we have different passions, and he talks about the one body, many parts, and then ties it together with the love chapter. But it kind of almost full circle in the conversation that part of the benefit is I can recognize that we are different, and yet
Yeah.
we're together,
Yeah.
right? And it's okay to not only okay to be different, but
Right.
okay to actually value and celebrate the way that the Lord has gifted us differently,
Right.
but to still recognize we're human beings. We're on the same team, right? And
Right.
especially for a part of the body of Christ, that we're all on mission together. So that's part of what I learned and loved about that conversation, is just that kind of strengths fosters that mutual appreciation and gives us language for how we can navigate our differences, but our
For sure.
sameness
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure.
What really stood out to me from that conversation was the effect on a team that has too.
Yeah.
Like that it's a unifying way, a unifying language that kind of helps everybody on the team to say, this is what I contribute, this is what I'm good at, this is how I understand what I'm good at.
Yeah.
And it gives you that positive language. I
It
think
does.
Stacey said that. It gives you this kind of way to communicate about what your team is doing, your purpose and your mission, and how somebody can be a part of it. And I just love that kind of like positive vision for how to get people on your team to just buy in a little bit more and contribute to something.
I wonder. go ahead.
I think in this day and age, we are so driven by comparison and competition so much, especially in leadership conversations. And I think that's one of the added values too, is having the freedom to say, look, you both are better at certain things than I am. And that in no way is a diminishment of my own gifting,
Right.
but it's true, right? And I can celebrate that rather than feeling threatened by it as an individual. I could say, man, so glad that you two and others are on our team, right? You
Right.
make us better.
Right.
And I celebrate that rather than saying, well, I really wish I was, or,
Yeah.
you know, or I'm better than you. You know, I just think it's such a healthier, more mature way to look
Yeah.
at development.
Well, and perhaps some of the dissonance that we see in societal conversations today is just simply because we don't have a unified language that we're speaking together. And so you've got one camp over here and one camp over here, really potentially communicating similar things, using different language, so to speak. And because of this lack of willingness to listen, and I would even say in line with the strengths conversation, lack of an ability to celebrate the strengths of others. We have now this dissonance that feels almost out of control. And so then we kind of shell ourselves back and insulate. And
so let me ask you guys a question. Where does that come from? Why is it difficult to celebrate other people, even those that we disagree? Why is it hard for us to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we've touched on this in some ways, but there's a kind of a zero-sum mentality. Zero-sum being, if you gain, I lose. And so trying to portray yourself as strong all the time. You know, if you celebrate somebody else, you're kind of highlighting them. I think there are examples of a more positive way of speaking that are definitely out there.
Sure.
And I wouldn't be surprised if even, you know, millennial generation and under is more used to a self-deprecating leader or a more positive, inclusive in the standpoint of trying to, you know, not ruffle anybody's feathers in a sense, and trying to, you know, give something positive to somebody else in that kind of setting. But I do think that there is a kind of a zero-sum mentality in a lot of ways that's crept up.
If you win, I lose. So I can't lose.
I agree with that. In fact, that's part of what I was thinking through, you know, as you were talking like that. I think that's really it. I also wonder if there's a bit of an identity crisis. People don't know who they are, and so therefore they don't know how to properly appreciate and celebrate how God made them. And if you can't do that for yourself, chances of you being able to do that for someone else is slim to none. And so we have, I think, an identity crisis.
Sure. Yeah, interesting.
Well, and I think because of that, Tori, and this kind of comes back, we attach those to things outside of ourselves, right?
Totally.
As Cubs fans,
God help us.
But whether it's a sport, I mean, how many people do we know that live for?
Oh, it's insane.
You know, whatever team it may be, or whatever party it may be, right? Because if we don't have this kind of sense of who we are inside of ourselves, we feel compelled to attach that to something else outside of ourselves, right? And it just creates a volatile mix.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think there's also an element of like individualism plays into this too, where, you know, we may not even be aware that we're so self-focused that we may not even be aware of the effect that that's having on other people. You know, it's really hard to contribute to something, a team, a group, a collective, if your focus is really about how does this advance me? How does this, you know, how does this tell my story? Whatever, you know. Maybe individualism plays into that. Yeah, too.
I think that's why our conversation with not Nahum, that's his brother. Whoops, right. Nathaniel and Audrey was so important. The Anderberg brothers, heyo. That's right. I think that's why that's so important, because servant leadership, in its essence, is not about self.
Yeah. Well, and I think it plays so much into another episode that I love, which was Dr. Josh McNall, just on dogmatism and doubt, and how our tendencies are to becoming increasingly dogmatic, right? And when we move towards a more dogmatic posture, we lose the capacity to just be able to converse, and, you know, we become defined by everything that we're against, right? And stood out to me.
Another inspiring moment from the season is an episode we just released, episode 29, which is a recording of Jim Bridenstine speaking on campus.
The man is brilliant.
We were just so grateful that that he came to campus, that he shared with us, that we were able to share that with you, the audience. It was really just a great storytelling and great recounting of the history of space exploration in this country, and the ways that faith has kind of played into that. One of the things that really stood out to me was just the whole story about the Apollo 8 astronauts. They were told, you know, probably for political reasons, not to share scripture or to pray, but they felt it really appropriate and important at that moment that they read Genesis 1 while they're orbiting the moon, while a majority of the globe is listening.
Yeah. And it's the first communication we have from space.
Yes.
And it's scripture.
Yeah.
How cool is that?
Yeah.
The fact that, and I don't, if you go back and listen to the conversation, it's really inspiring. One of the things that he said early in the conversation was just at that time, this sense of competition with the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Now, the Soviet Union was beating us in space, and they had sent the first man actually into space. And everything he had to say publicly was so supportive of the Communist Party and very political in that sense. And that when these our astronauts, the NASA astronauts, make it to space and to the moon, and they have this chance to broadcast, they say something that's for humanity.
Yeah.
That's a word of hope in a time of fear. I found that really inspiring.
Yeah.
What about you guys? Any inspiring moments from that episode or any other episodes from this season?
Man, I keep going back and listening to that one, and I even attended the event in person. Just a fascinating take on space exploration and how faith can intersect anything, including that.
Right.
And you think, again, kind of along the lines of the competition and at that time with the Soviet Union, knowing that in that particular area of the world, a presentation of the gospel was not possible and in a easy way. And so these guys take advantage of a moment on the world stage, you could even argue the universe stage, to share the gospel. And I wonder how many people listen to this podcast, or maybe even people that don't listen to the podcast, but in their everyday life and the work that God has put before them, they wonder, like, how can I be a tool for the kingdom? How can the Lord even use the work that I'm doing? Like, chances are none of us are going to space. I don't know. Like, I don't have any trips planned.
I don't know.
That'd
Ben
be cool,
would
though.
probably really wants to go.
I mean,
talk about
I wouldn't
space,
turn it
Ben.
down.
Yeah.
I wouldn't turn it down.
And it doesn't have to be something extravagant like that. But, like, the Lord can use anything. He can use any field. He can use any discipline, any domain, really, to share that hope. And how cool is it that they use their work, as astronauts? That's pretty cool. To communicate the gospel message to the world. I don't know, just a really cool demonstration of how faith intersects our work.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Do you think part of the power of, because what they did was an act of rebellion, right?
Oh, for
NASA
sure.
made it clear that we don't really want you to do that, and they did it anyway. But do you think that there was something transcendent about the creation story and kind of what they read of that gave people hope that instead of being defined between the United States and the Soviets and the space race and all this different stuff, but to look at the bigger picture of God created this, right?
Yeah.
Is there something transcendental about that? Something transcendent that what they
sure.
shared got us above the fray of arms race, space race, nuclear standoff.
It
and all
got
these
us
different
beyond
things.
ourselves,
right?
honestly,
Yes.
and the human constructs. And it pointed us to what actually matters, what actually has weight and is eternal, for sure.
Yeah, that's a great observation and a good reminder, that what is happening in our particular moment, even on a large scale between governments or ideologies, may not matter 50 years in the future. Right. May not matter 10 years in the future.
And that's one of the things that I've heard several astronauts say is they're almost overwhelmed with grief when they go to space because they look at this celestial ball suspended in space and realize the sum total of all that we know is contained, and how much time we spend bickering, arguing, fighting wars, all this different stuff, and yet there's so much more that's out there, right, that God created, that the things that we major on, the differences that we have in the grand scheme of things maybe don't. A lot of them don't matter. Some do, but a lot of them don't matter that much.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the opportunity to be part of contributing to something, building and that lasts beyond a generation or two, something that lasts into the future, I think is ultimately what a lot of people are looking for. And I think that's kind of touches at the heart of part of why we want to do this podcast is help communicate about the journey of learning and being transformed by that to create something lasting and beautiful and meaningful that kind of goes and lives beyond the kind of ranker of the moment.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited and grateful to hear from either of you, just the different conversations we've had.
Season 2 was fun.
It was.
It was fun.
It was a good one.
Definitely. It was great to even behind the scenes be a part of it with you all.
And you jumped in as a host this season.
We need to do this more often. We need to give this guy one more
It was
often.
fun.
Yeah. We're glad to have you.
Well, thank you. It was fun. I'm passionate about film and kind of a history nerd too. So it was great to talk with Julie Huffstetler. That conversation was just really fun in a lot of ways. And it's great to even just kind of hear feedback from people. Thank you for listening to and commenting on that episode of just, a deep dive on a film that really touches on something important in history. So love that. Looking forward to more opportunities for that here in the future.
And the feedback that folks can give us is just so vital to these conversations and knowing what's helpful, right?
Absolutely.
So we definitely appreciate people not only tuning in, but giving that feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's where you come in, audience. Thank you for coming on this journey with us on Season 2. We need your help for Season 3. This summer, we're taking a little bit of a hiatus and break as we prepare for Season 3, picking up at the end of the summer. And that's where you come in. We would love to hear from you topics that you would find helpful, engaging, things that you want to learn more about with us. We have a poll for you to respond to. Look in the comments section here. Look below whatever platform you're listening or watching this on for a poll option of how you can help us bring more and better engaging content in Season 3. Tori and Ben, thank you so much. And
Always.
looking forward to Season 3.